Welcome to our deep dive on anger. You've given us some really fascinating verses from the Bible,
hmm
all dealing with how anger is addressed in these ancient texts. Ready to see what we can find.
Absolutely. It's always interesting to me how texts from thousands of years ago can still speak to something as human as anger.
Okay, so
Yeah.
one thing that jumped out at me was how often the Bible links anger with foolishness. Like Ecclesiastes 7.9 says, be not hasty in thy spirit, to be angry, for anger resteth in the bosom of fools. It's pretty direct.
It is. I think what's important here is not just about avoiding outbursts, but about seeing the connection between anger and wisdom. The text seems to imply that if we can't control our anger, it could be a sign we're not thinking clearly, our judgment's clouded.
So it's less about appearing calm and more about making wise decisions.
Exactly. And that connects to the idea of developing strong character. The Bible actually offers a lot of practical advice on managing anger, especially in Proverbs, almost like a guidebook for navigating those heated moments.
Yeah, like Proverbs 16.32. The discretion of a man makes him slow to anger, and his glory is to overlook a transgression. Basically saying, pick your battles.
Right. And the implication there is really interesting. Holding on to anger, letting it fester, can actually be more damaging to ourselves than to the person who wronged us. Like that saying, holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. You're the one who ends up suffering.
Makes you think about what triggers your own anger
Right.
and whether it's worth holding on to.
Absolutely. And it raises the question of what putting away bitterness actually looks like. Because Ephesians 4.31 is pretty clear. Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and evil speaking be put away from you with all malice.
So it's not just about suppressing anger. What about actively removing it?
Exactly. But it's not just about changing your behavior either. Remember, Ephesians 4 also talks about being renewed in the spirit of your mind. That seems to point to something deeper, a transformation of our inner world.
So like putting on a new self.
Exactly. Ephesians 4 tells us to put on the new man, which after God is created in righteousness and true holiness. What's so interesting here is that it's not about denying anger, but about replacing it with something better. With qualities like patience, gentleness, and love, those become the antidotes to anger's destructive power.
But is it always about replacement? Could there be times when anger is justified, even necessary?
That's a great question. Not all anger is the same. Even the Bible gives us examples of righteous anger. Think about Jesus cleansing the temple. He sees a money changers exploiting people in a sacred space, and he's filled with anger. But his anger isn't about a personal offense. It's about injustice.
So the difference is in the motivation behind the anger.
Exactly. Jesus' anger in the temple is directed at correcting a wrong, restoring order. It comes from his love for what is sacred, not personal resentment. Even in anger, his actions are controlled and purposeful.
But even if the anger is justified, couldn't it still lead to bad outcomes?
There's always a risk. That's why self-control is so crucial. Remember what Ephesians 4.26 says? In your anger, do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you are still angry, even in righteous anger. We need to be careful not to let it control us.
So how do we walk that line? How do we know if anger is justified? And how do we express it in a healthy way?
The Bible gives us some clues. It contrasts righteous anger with the anger that comes from selfishness, jealousy, or resentment. Think about Cain and Abel. Cain's anger toward his brother, fueled by jealousy, leads him to commit a terrible act.
It's a tragic story. It shows how destructive unchecked anger can be.
Right. And it's interesting that God actually tries to reason with Cain before he acts, asking him, why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? It's like God's giving Cain a chance to recognize his anger, to take responsibility for it, and to choose a different path.
So the Bible's saying that we have a choice in how we respond to anger. It's not something that just overwhelms us.
Exactly. We're not helpless victims of our emotions. We can choose to acknowledge our anger, to examine the reasons for it,
Yeah.
and to respond in a way that's in line with our values. Thinking about relationships, Proverbs 18.19 really stands out. A brother offended is harder to win than a strong city, and contentions are like bars of a castle.
Wow. That really shows how much damage anger can do to relationships, like putting up walls that are almost impossible to get through.
Yeah. And it makes you think about how important it is to deal with conflicts quickly
Yeah.
before they have a chance to become these huge barriers.
Mhm.
It's easier to fix a small crack than to rebuild a whole wall,
Just be proactive.
Yeah.
Don't let that anger build up those walls.
Exactly. Remember in Ephesians, in your anger, do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you are still angry. It's like a call to deal with things head on, to find reconciliation before resentment sets in and makes those walls too high to climb.
It reminds me of the story of Joseph and his brothers. Now there's a family feud. Jealousy and anger led them to do some terrible things.
That's a powerful story. It shows just how long-lasting the effects of anger and betrayal can be. Years go by, the walls stay up, and the pain just festers.
But then we see that incredible moment of reconciliation. Joseph had every right to hold on to his anger, but he chooses forgiveness instead.
Such a powerful example of how forgiveness can transform things. Joseph not only frees himself from that bitterness, but he opens the way for healing and restoration for his whole family.
It's a good reminder that forgiveness isn't just about the person who hurt us. It's also about letting go of anger and resentment, freeing ourselves from those burdens.
Exactly. And it's interesting that Joseph's forgiveness isn't passive. He confronts his brothers, calls them out on what they did, but he still chooses to let go of that bitterness and offer them grace.
So it's not about pretending it didn't happen. It's about acknowledging the wrong, but choosing to move forward.
You got it. And that can be so hard, especially when we've been really hurt. But the Bible reminds us that we have a model for this kind of radical forgiveness, God himself.
Yeah, in Micah, it says, "Who is a God like you, who pardons sin and forgives the transgression of the remnant of his inheritance? You do not stay angry forever, but delight to show mercy." It's saying we're called to be like God, to offer forgiveness even when it's difficult.
Absolutely. And that kind of forgiveness isn't weakness. It takes incredible strength and courage. It's much harder to let go of anger than to hold on to it.
But let's be real, forgiveness doesn't always happen right away. Sometimes it's a journey. It takes time to work through the hurt and get to a place of letting go.
That's true. And we see that in the Bible, too. The Psalms are full of raw emotion, honestly portraying the struggle with anger and forgiveness.
Right, like when the writer cries out to God, expressing his anger and resentment toward his enemies.
You're thinking of Psalm 35. It's intense. The writer wants justice. He wants his enemies to suffer.
But even in those raw emotions, there's a glimmer of hope. Ultimately, he puts his trust in God, recognizing that vengeance is God's.
Exactly. And that's so important. We can bring all of our anger and hurt to God, knowing that he understands, he cares, and he'll work things out in the end.
It's like a reminder that we don't have to carry that weight alone. We can let God handle it,
Mm-hmm.
trusting in his justice and his mercy.
And that act of letting go, of surrendering it to God, is often the first step toward healing and forgiveness.
You know what strikes me about these examples? Forgiveness is rarely something we do on our own.
Mm-hmm.
It usually involves reconciliation, bringing that relationship back together.
That's a really good point. And the Bible actually gives us some guidance on what that might look like. In Matthew 18, Jesus lays out a process for handling conflict within the church. He emphasizes going directly to the person who wronged you, trying to work things out privately.
Taking responsibility and offering grace.
Exactly. And if you can't resolve it one-on-one, Jesus suggests bringing in others from the community to help. It's a reminder that we're not meant to go through this alone. We have a community, a support system to help us through tough times.
It takes humility to admit we're wrong, to seek forgiveness, and to be open to reconciliation. And it takes courage to offer forgiveness, to trust that the relationship can be healed.
But the rewards are so worth it. Reconciliation brings healing, rebuilds trust, and makes relationships stronger.
And it creates this ripple effect. When we choose forgiveness and reconciliation in our own lives, we're hoping to create a more peaceful world.
I love that. Our choices, our actions, they have an impact that goes way beyond ourselves. They shape our families, our communities, and ultimately the world we live in.
We've talked about how destructive anger can be in relationships, the challenges of forgiveness, and the beauty of reconciliation. But there's one thing we haven't touched on yet. Communication. How do we talk about anger in a healthy way, especially with people closest to us?
That's such an important question. And as always, the Bible has some valuable insights, Proverbs especially, is full of wisdom on using our words well, particularly when it comes to anger.
What verses come to mind?
Well, Proverbs 15.1 for one. A gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. It shows how powerful our words can be. They can either make things worse or calm things down.
Choosing kindness and understanding, even when we're hurting.
Exactly, and that takes a lot of self-control, especially when emotions are running high. But Proverbs 17.27 reminds us, "He who restrains his words has knowledge, and he who has a cool spirit is a man of understanding." Real wisdom is knowing when to speak and when to be quiet, controlling our impulses and responding thoughtfully instead of reacting.
So it's not just about what we say, but how we say it.
Absolutely. Our tone of voice, our body language, all of it sends a message. If we come into a conversation with anger and aggression, It's just going to make the other person defensive. But when we speak calmly and respectfully, even when we're expressing tough emotions, it creates space for understanding and dialogue.
It makes me think about those times when we need to express our anger, but we don't want to hurt anyone. How do we find that balance?
Ephesians 4.29 gives us some direction. Let no corrupting talk come out of your mouths, but only such as is good for building up as fits the occasion, that it may give grace to those who hear. It reminds us that our words should build people up, not tear them down, even when we're angry. Our goal should be to communicate our needs and feelings in a way that leads to understanding and resolution.
Being assertive but not aggressive, owning our feelings but expressing them respectfully.
Exactly. And remember, healthy communication goes both ways. It's not just about speaking clearly and respectfully. It's also about listening actively and empathetically.
Trying to see things from their perspective, even if we don't agree.
Right. James 1.19 says, "Let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger." Taking the time to really listen can help to lower the tension and make it easier to resolve conflict.
So managing anger in relationships isn't just about not yelling. It's about self-control, choosing our words carefully, listening closely, and coming into conflict wanting to understand and reconcile.
It's about seeing conflict as a chance to grow and connect, not as a fight to be won or lost.
These biblical principles offer amazing guidance for navigating relationships in the way that honors everyone involved.
And in our last segment, let's tie all this together and see how we can actually apply these teachings to our lives. How do we move from understanding these ideas to living them out, especially when we're feeling angry and tempted to lose control?
Okay, so we've talked about how destructive anger can be, the power of forgiveness, and how to communicate in a healthy way. But as we wrap up, the big question is, how do we actually put all of this into practice in our lives?
That's the challenge, isn't it? I think the most important thing is to remember that it's a journey, not something we're going to master overnight. It's about making small changes, being intentional, and relying on God's grace to guide us.
So how do we even get started?
Well, one practical thing is to start noticing what triggers your anger. What are the things that set you off? Is it certain people, situations, maybe even specific thoughts? Once you figure out what those triggers are, you can start coming up with ways to handle them.
So if we know what to watch out for, we can be more prepared to react in a healthy way.
Exactly. That might mean taking a few deep breaths before you react, walking away from a situation if it's getting too heated, or using those communication skills we talked about.
It's like having a set of tools you can use when you start feeling angry.
That's a great way to think about it. And just like any skill, managing anger takes practice. The more you practice those techniques, the easier it will become.
But what about those times when we mess up? When we totally lose it and say or do something we regret?
That's where forgiveness comes in, both for ourselves and for others. We need to show ourselves the same grace we give to other people. We're all human. We're all going to make mistakes. The important thing is to learn from them and keep trying.
So admitting when we're wrong, taking responsibility,
Yeah,
and giving ourselves a break as we try to improve.
exactly. That self-compassion can make a big difference in how we handle our anger.
The Bible talks about renewing our minds. Is that something we can actively do?
Absolutely. Remember Romans 12.2. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. It reminds us that our thoughts have a powerful influence on our actions.
So if we want to change how we act, we have to start with how we think.
Exactly. That might mean challenging those negative thoughts, focusing on what you're grateful for, or spending time meditating on Scripture. The more we fill our minds with truth and positivity, the more our hearts and actions will reflect that.
This has been such a helpful conversation. I feel like I understand anger so much better now. It's not just this negative force, but something we can learn to understand, manage, and even transform.
I'm glad to hear that. I think the most important thing to remember is that we don't have to let anger control us. The Bible gives us so much wisdom and guidance to help us navigate this complex emotion in a way that honors God and brings up more peace and happiness.
It's a journey
Yeah.
about being patient with ourselves and trusting God to help us grow and change.
Well said. It's a lifelong process, but definitely worth the effort.
I want to thank you for joining me on this deep dive. I hope it's been as insightful and encouraging for our listeners as it has been for me.
It's been a pleasure exploring these important truths with you. May we all continue to grow in our understanding of anger and strive to live lives filled with peace, love, and forgiveness.